Hello, everyone. This is Kevin Padula, the creator and host of the Story of Rhode Island podcast. What you're about to listen to is the first of what I hope will be many conversations with Rhode Island historians or people who are helping others to better understand Rhode Island history. So, this discussion is with Dr. David Weed, and he's from the Sowams Heritage Area project, which he'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. During the conversation, we're going to cover four primary topics. It's all going to be based around the Pokanoket tribe, whose home was located in the Bristol Warren, Rhode Island area. We'll look at what their life looked like before the arrival of Europeans. We'll look at their interactions with some of the first English settlers, like the Pilgrims of Plymouth Colony, and then the early Rhode Islanders as well, like Roger Williams, of course. And then we'll wrap it up by discussing Metacom's Rebellion, something that's more commonly referred to as King Philip's War. What exactly was the Pokanoket's role in that? And then how did it affect their people and their tribe following the conflict? So I hope you enjoy this. And without further ado, here we go. All right, so Dr. Weed, thank you so much, or as you said, I should call you David for being on the podcast. The work you're doing with the Sowams Heritage Area has been super impactful and a really critical part of the research that I'm doing for the Story of Rhode Island podcast. So thank you so much for being here. To kick it off, if you don't mind, I'd love you to just tell a little bit about yourself to my listeners and what you're working on with the Sowams Heritage Area project.
Sure, Kevin. I'd be happy to, and thank you for inviting me. I've been working for the past 6 years on a project to create a new national heritage area across 5 communities in Massachusetts, and from Providence to Bristol, and 4 communities in Massachusetts: Rehoboth, Seekonk, Somerset, and Swansea. The national heritage areas are living, working landscapes that honor the important role of a region in our country's development and celebrate its contributions to American history and culture. I first began getting into the early history of this region when the Massasoit Usamiquan, who welcomed the Pilgrims in 1621, was reburied behind my house in 2017. I'll tell you more about that later. I've since learned everything I could about the amazing history of that area that was called Sowams, and have gotten to know today's Pokanoket tribe, the descendants of Usamiquan, who live nearby. In the process, I've created an extensive website at sowamsheritagearea.org. It's a 501 nonprofit corporation, and have obtained grants to support a feasibility study. So our hope is to have the National Park Service agree that this area has a story of national significance that needs to be told, and have the U.S. Congress fund the project.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I think the work you've been doing has been super important, and I know that I spend a lot of time on your website looking at all the information you have. So I'd really stress, if anyone's listening, to take a look at the Sowams Heritage Area website, because it's really interesting, all the information that's on there. I want to move into painting the picture of Eastern Rhode Island, where the Pokanokets primarily lived before the arrival of English colonists. The reason I want to focus on that is because when I was doing my research for the podcast, I was really shocked to see how large those communities were, and then how long they had lived in the area for. One of the stats that I saw was by 1600, there were 70,000 to 100,000 people in New England.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah. And one of those, of course, being the Pokanoket people who lived in Eastern Rhode Island, and then eventually moving into southeastern Massachusetts as well. So tell me a little bit about how long people have inhabited the Bristol County area for, and what type of archaeological evidence we've uncovered about them.
Well, I'm not an archaeologist, but I've looked into what is available online, and so far the earliest archaeological evidence for human occupation in southern New England is at the sands of the Blackstone site in Uxbridge.
Hmm.
It's just over the Massachusetts border. It was radiocarbon dated at 11,990, plus or minus 60 years. But basically, what we're talking about is 12,000 years ago.
Wow.
There was considerable variation across time and space in the way that prehistoric people of the region organized their subsistence activities. But it appears that the coast was occupied by relatively large groups throughout the year,
Hmm.
often without the benefit of maize or horticulture. In other words, they hunted and gathered rather than
Hmm.
stayed in one place and raised crops. But other than that, the absence of written records doesn't give us a clue as to what else went on at that time.
Yeah. So is there any other information or like details we have about what maybe life would have looked like for the Pokanoket people before the arrival of Europeans?
Well, over the last few centuries, we understand that the settlement system was heading toward the pattern that the colonists found in 1600, in which major nucleated villages were
Mm,
located on main streams, often at the head of estuaries,
mm,
where smaller satellite sites such as Shell Midden served as a special purpose camp.
mm,
Uh, the unfortunate aspect of the late prehistoric settlement pattern is that the large central village sites were virtually all located at the very places most favored by European settlers.
mm,
So they've long since been buried and covered over with buildings and pavement. And few, if any, of these important sites have survived well enough to yield much information through excavation. Mostly what we find is when there's some kind of a road construction or housing or building construction, and there we dig down several feet and discover things that we didn't know were there.
mm. Yeah, like Burrs Hill
Yep.
and Warren. Yeah. Um, and so when I think of like the land that now makes up Rhode Island before the arrival of Europeans, I not only think of the Pokanokets in the east, like the Bristol County area, but then also, of course, the Narragansett people to the west of Narragansett Bay. And I found it interesting how they had such a rivalry going on, and it seems like they were butting heads a lot. So, what do we know about the history of that rivalry and maybe even how it came about?
Well, we really have no recorded history of both tribes before the arrival of the colonists, so we can only speculate.
Hmm.
But the geography of Narragansett Bay suggests that the Narragansetts and the Niantics and the Pequots in today's southern Rhode Island and Connecticut remained physically separated from the Pokanokets, who were situated on the northeastern shore of the bay in a 10-mile wide region known as Sowams. So really Narragansett Bay kept the two different tribes apart.
Hmm.
Uh, the great leader Osamequin, who lived here, organized over 60 bands, tribes, and clans to the east, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, into a single nation.
Hmm.
That the Narragansetts, led by Canonicus and Miantinomi, were interested in taking over Osamequin's territory when his tribes were greatly weakened in the Great Dying of 1616, 1619,
Hmm.
is suggested by the recorded gesture of sending arrowheads wrapped in a snakeskin
Yeah.
when Plymouth was negotiating a peace treaty with Osamequin. And of course, um, the snakeskin was returned with gunpowder and shot to communicate to the Narragansetts that they weren't welcome to move east. And
Yeah.
several years later, attempts by the Narragansetts to move into Osamequin's land were rebuffed by the English under Miles Standish's leadership.
Hmm.
So, basically you have two large populations. Um, I would say the Narragansetts were more interested in moving into the Sowams area
Hmm.
than vice versa, largely because this was This is the best place to live in New England. I'm convinced.
Nice. Um, yeah, you brought up something interesting there where there was that time period in 1616 to 1619 called the Great Dying, where we see this like just hugely deadly epidemic um, hit the East Coast of New England. So um, tell us a little about like what that is exactly and what event what caused it and how it affected the Pokanoket people.
Sure, again, what we know is only from English written accounts, but it's clear from reports that were recorded that a large number of indigenous people were wiped out by one or more infectious diseases starting in 1616.
Mm,
The prevailing theory is that those diseases were carried by French traders along the Maine coast, and the infections spread rapidly to the south, killing up to as much as 90% of the coastal tribes.
mm, oh,
Um, could have been yellow fever, smallpox, plague, chickenpox, trichinosis, but the most recent theory is that it was an outbreak of leptospirosis,
mm,
or possibly a combination of several diseases. But in any case, the indigenous people had no resistance and quickly succumbed.
mm,
And also, without their understanding the nature of infections, their response was to gather closely around each victim in their dying hours, but
mm,
then increase the spread of the disease.
yeah.
So this population loss, of course, left the Pokanoket Nation vulnerable to invasion by the Narragansetts, who were seemingly unaffected by the pandemic west of Narragansett Bay.
Mm,
So only the Pokanokets they lost their warriors, their elders, and their collective histories, as well as their faith in their spiritual leaders who were unable to heal the sick and dying. So,
mm.
we get concerned by losing 1 million people in the COVID pandemic, but imagine losing 90% of the American population. I mean, just totally devastating.
Yeah. The effect on like the psyche of the people must have been astronomical. And then when you see that the English are not being affected, it must like automatically put something in your mind where they have a more powerful God or something about them that is superior to us. So you can see how that creates like a concern or a fear of the English as well. Um,
Yep.
yeah. So that's of course brought on unknowingly by European colonists, and it's a disease that the indigenous people have no immunity to. So they start dying in great numbers. But one of the other groups of European colonists that come over to America are, of course, the radical group of Protestants known as separatists, and they settle in an area that the Pokanoket people knew as Patuxet, what we know as Plymouth today. And I've always found it really interesting because they settle in December of 1620, but it's not until the following year in the spring where the Pokanokets, Massasoit, Osamequin goes over and approaches them and finally develops that relationship with them. So can you tell my listeners a little bit about why he was so hesitant to approach them, but then finally what inspired him to go over there and meet them?
Sure. Well, again, we have no written records of Osamequin's thought process, so we're only
Sure.
left with speculation.
Yeah.
But some theories are that he feared the English could bring more disease to unleash on the tribes.
Mm,
In fact, they thought the English kept the disease in a box, and
mm,
all they had to do was open it, and the tribes would be devastated. But given that the English arrived with women and children, they posed less of a threat.
mm,
And up to half of the English died during that first winter, thus reducing the threat. So they were being observed by the Pokanoket people in those first 4 months. Uh, but also knowing that they had guns and cannons, Osamequin saw that an alliance could help to even the balance of power with the Narragansetts.
mm,
So he chose the vernal equinox. That's not just by happenstance. That was a spiritually important date,
mm,
and he sent Tisquantum or Squanto, who could speak English to arrange a first meeting. Actually, he had Somerset go first. His English wasn't as good, but
Mm,
Tisquantum had lived in England for a number of years, so he could easily communicate with them. And Bradford and Winslow's later descriptions indicated that the alliance was easily arranged, as both sides could see a clear benefit. They came up with a 6-point no harm agreement that held for the next 50 years, just before
mm,
until the start of the King Philip's War.
mm. Yeah, you brought up Squanto there. For listeners, if you want to hear about an interesting life tale, look up the story of Tisquantum, or also known as Squantum. He was, I believe, kidnapped twice and then brought to Spain, and then made it to London and made it back and everything. So pretty pretty incredible story there. If you want to
Right,
dive into it.
fascinating. Right.
Yeah, yeah. It's also tragic though, because he comes back and sees the Patuxet people, the tribe he was a part of, completely wiped out. So, um, which was part of the 16 dying. But anyway, so the Pilgrims and the Pokanokets have that relationship. It's going on for a couple of years, and then there's this famous event that we know as Thanksgiving today that happens in fall of 1623. So tell us a little
Oh,
bit about.
1621. It was the next year.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So tell us a little bit about what we know took place that day. Like what are historical facts that we're aware of?
Well, certainly what happened there was nothing like what we were taught in school. The event likely occurred in October, not November.
Mm,
And it was probably a typical English harvest fest to give thanks for the successful harvest that they had.
mm,
Um, Usamiquan and his 90 warriors were not issued an invitation, but were likely hunting in the area and heard gunfire from the colonists who were out hunting fowl for their feast.
mm,
Uh, so the tribe joined them, and they remained for 3 days, and they brought in 5 deer to add to the larder. This wasn't a religious event for the English, which would have been marked by fasting and prayer,
mm,
but it did indicate that there was a large degree of trust between the two groups, which lasted for a substantial period of time.
mm.
It wasn't till the arrival of over 1,000 Puritans to the north in 1630 that the gradual erosion of that trust due to unjust land deeds and attempts at religious conversion began to change things.
Uh, Good segue. You brought up the Puritans. One of the people that came over with them, who was actually a separatist, is of course Roger Williams. Perhaps my favorite historical figure. So he comes to America. He has his issues with Massachusetts and Plymouth, and then he eventually gets banned in the winter of 1635. Makes a run for it in 1636 when he realizes some troops are coming for him because he couldn't shut up about religious freedom. So what do we know about Roger Williams' relationship with the Pokanoket people?
Well, that's important. Williams left London with his wife in December of 1630, and that was really part of the Great Migration of English, who brought over 1,000 people here, most of whom regarded the Church of England as corrupt. Um, about 20,000 settlers would leave England for New England between 1630 and 1640. So it was a huge migration, often called the Great Migration. Williams arrives in Boston in February and heads to Plymouth, where he gets to know Usamiquan and learns his language. Williams was excellent at learning other languages. And after 3 years, he took a position as a teacher in the Salem Church, just north of Boston. But his dangerous ideas of separating religious and political authority were not popular.
Mm,
And he was threatened, as you say, by the church authorities in October, the expulsion back to England. Before they could capture him in January of 1636, he escaped, walked over 60 miles in freezing cold weather and snow in search of Usamiquan
mm,
to his south. And suffering from exposure, he's found by the Pokanokets and taken into their winter settlement next to Margaret's Rock in today's Swansea, where he's
mm,
nursed back to health over 14 weeks.
mm,
So in April, after that period of time, Usamiquan suggests that he go to a place near a spring at Omega Pond along the shore of the Seekonk River in today's East Providence. Uh, that site is marked today, but very few people know about it.
Yeah.
But in June, as his crops, his corn is just beginning to sprout, Ed Winslow orders him to cross the river because he's in Plymouth colony land. So, negotiating with the Narragansett chief Canonicus, who Williams got to know, he enters what is today Providence and settles along the east shore of the Mashasik River, and advocates that all colonists purchase their land from the local tribal authorities.
Yeah. So we have the Pokanokets and Osamequin to thank for saving Roger Williams' life, and then the Narragansetts to thank for allowing him to found Providence.
Right.
Yeah. So then we have Roger Williams founding Providence in 1636, but we also have some other religious outcasts coming into the Narragansett Bay Area, which is mostly Narragansett territory, and they purchased the island of Aquidneck, found Portsmouth and Newport, and what ends up being the colony of Rhode Island really starts to develop. I hear a lot about the relationship between the Pokanoket people in Plymouth and Massachusetts, but what did the relationship look like between the Pokanoket people and those early Rhode Islanders? What did that look like?
Well, since first of all, there were no colonists known to be living in today's Rhode Island before William Blackstone, who came a year before Roger Williams in 1635. And given that Williams spent time in Plymouth before moving to Salem, one can assume that he was on good terms with Osamequin and his people over that time. But we really don't have anything recorded of the interaction between Osamequin and Williams. Williams does not write about the Pokanokets other than his relationship with Osamequin. But it can be assumed that Williams continued to be on good terms, and the positive relationship only ended during King Philip's War, when Williams sided with the colonial authorities at the end of the war and advocated sending surviving Pokanoket warriors into slavery in Barbados. But remember, it was the Narragansetts who burned Williams' settlement in Providence, and not Metacom's Pokanokets. Yeah,
that's a good point. So I'm curious because we've started to dive into the world of Metacom's rebellion, which starts in the summer of 1675. And by the way, Metacom's rebellion, for listeners, is also known as King Philip's War. And it's incredible how devastating the event is. Not only are thousands of English colonists killed and English towns, and there's livestock destroyed, but in Schultz's book about King Philip's War, I think he says like 15% of the indigenous population in New England is killed throughout the war. So it's really like an amazingly devastating event that isn't discussed too much today. Before we dive into it a little bit more, can you tell the listeners who Metacom, or as the English call him, King Philip, is, or who he was, and why the rebellion is named after him?
Sure. Yeah, I know. Oftentimes people wonder which English king King Philip was.
Yeah.
And it's confusing. I understand. Metacom, or what he was really named as Po Metacomet, was the younger son of the Massasoit Osamequin. His older brother Wamsutta took over leadership of the Pokanoket Nation when his father died in 1661. Both Wamsutta and Metacom requested English names and were given Alexander and Philip as English names, thinking it would raise their status in English eyes. A year after Osamequin's death, Wamsutta was called to Plymouth to answer charges that he was planning a war with the English. He denied it, but on his return to Sowams, he died of unknown causes, and his younger brother Metacom suspected that he was poisoned. So Metacom, the younger of the two sons, becomes the Massasoit, a role for which he was not prepared as a young man. But he began to be referred to as King Philip to place him on an equal footing with the English king, King Charles, who ruled over the colonists. So that was a way of having equivalent status.
Mm,
Uh, Philip attempted to maintain positive relationships with the English, but his people were treated unjustly on more and more occasions, and he began to reach out to the Nipmuc and Pokanoket tribes to advocate for war against the colonists.
mm,
He was always seen as the instigator of the war, but other tribal leaders had long advocated for war as well.
mm,
What they all wanted was to drive the English back to England, uh, fearing that if they didn't, they would end up with no country of their own.
mm. Can you dive into that part you were mentioning about some of the tensions between the Pokanoket people and the Plymouth colonies, the Plymouth colonists, and go into a little bit more detail about how it eventually led up to Metacon's rebellion, or as it's also known, King Philip's War.
Sure, there's an awful lot that's been written about it, but just very briefly, the basis of the conflicts essentially boiled down to greed over land. While land was sold and deeds were signed, indigenous people did not understand that this meant that they had lost all of their rights to travel, hunt, or raise crops on land that was sold. Uh,
Mm,
they didn't grow up with the idea of private property. But as English families had more and more children, their need for new land grew exponentially.
mm,
Furthermore, the English would let their cows and pigs freely graze, including on indigenous gardens. And the English expected that the gardens would be fenced uh, by the Pokanokets to keep the animals out, but the Pokanokets wanted the English to fence their animals in to keep them away from their gardens.
yeah.
So there was a lot of disagreement, and there's a lot of recorded court activity about that.
Mm,
Just prior to the outbreak of the war, 3 native men were accused of murdering a praying Indian minister, John Sassamon, up near Lakeville. Rather than turning the case over to the tribe to settle, as had been agreed in the 1621 treaty, the English tried the accused, found them guilty, and hung them. Within weeks, the first salvo of the war occurred in Swansea, when an English farm was burned and its cattle killed. The war quickly spread from Swansea into Dartmouth and then all the way up to Deerfield in northwestern Massachusetts before it drew to a close 14 months later with the death of Philip at
mm,
Mount Hope in today's Bristol.
mm. So it started in the Bristol Warren area, and then, for all intents and purposes, ended in that area as well.
Correct.
Yeah. And one thing that's important to note that shocked me when learning about Metacon's rebellion is how well the indigenous people were performing during the early parts of the war. Because, like, if you look at Rhode Island in March of 1676, Wickford, Warwick, Providence, what's now East Providence, are essentially all destroyed. And you see Rhode Island colonists fleeing Rhode Island, taking up refuge on Aquidneck, and that's going on throughout New England as well. I mean, towns are just absolutely being destroyed by the indigenous warriors, but eventually the English come out on top, and it turns into a pretty devastating ending for the Pokanoket people. So, can you tell the listeners a little bit about what happens to the Pokanoket people when the war finally ends?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. It looked for a while, up until let's say December of 1675, that the tribes were going to achieve their objective. They
Mm,
burned over 25 English villages, and people had not only moved to Aquidneck Island or back to Boston. Some of them went back to England.
wow,
They really thought that this was the end,
wow.
and it wasn't until the following spring when the tribes began to run out of food. Remember, the war started right in June, so they couldn't even harvest their first crops, and
Mm,
then began to run out of shot and ammunition,
mm,
which they had acquired from both the English and the Dutch. But things began to really go south by that following spring. Well over half of the indigenous people had died in the war. and as many as 3,000 by some estimates,
Wow.
with an estimated 800 English deaths. So that war really remains the bloodiest war per capita on North American soil, even
Mm,
though it's rarely mentioned. Of those men who survived, if they were not of the indigenous, the tribal people, if they were not killed outright, most were sold into chattel slavery in the Caribbean islands. Surviving women and children were reclassified as indentured servants for generations, which was essentially identical to slavery in all but name.
mm,
The Pokanokets were unable to speak their language or even identify as being Pokanoket. So they had to go into hiding.
mm,
After the war, large numbers were sent into a reservation in Chatucket, Connecticut, where they were overseen by Uncas who abused them.
mm,
Only after a century were they permitted to move back into Rhode Island, and many moved to Providence in the 19th and 20th centuries in search of work. Uh, they often passed as non-native, saying they were Portuguese or black.
mm,
And when they first began to emerge in the 20th century under Princess Redwing, they called themselves Wampanoag.
mm,
It's only in this century have Pokanokets began to reclaim their name and have dropped the Wampanoag designation. The tribe now numbers over 300, and they gather several times a year in their original homeland of Sowams. I was just with them at their June Strawberry Moon Thanksgiving.
huh,
Uh, in early August, they hold a public Heritage Day event at Burrs Hill Park in Warren, the site of the Massasoit Usamiquan's burial. So people are certainly welcome to come there. This will be on August 6th this year, and it's a great chance to get to know the Pokanoket tribe.
nice. That's really neat. And one of the things I'd want to state for my listeners is how when I was working on creating some of the scripts for the episodes, I was close to when discussing the indigenous people of Rhode Island, calling the Pokanoket people Wampanoag, because that's what you see in a lot of history books. It's pretty frequent in history books, so it's almost easy to miss. But the work you're doing with the Sowams Heritage Area site led me to find out that it's actually the name Pokanoket before King Philip's War, and it was only after the war where they were forced to adopt the name Wampanoag. So um, really interesting there. What I'd love to end on is where the Pokanoket tribe stands today. What do they look like? How big is their tribe? And why is it important that we study and understand their history?
Well, absolutely. And the the quick answer is the Pokanoket tribal members look like everybody else. You might pass them in the grocery store and never know they're Pokanoket unless you ask them.
Mm,
Uh, this notion that Indians are supposed to look like Indians, that's ridiculous.
mm,
They don't walk around in regalia every day. Uh, they have families, they have jobs, the children attend school, and they contribute to the community just like everybody else.
mm,
They're proud of their heritage, and on special occasions, they do wear their regalia and tell their story to the general public. But their job every day isn't explaining who they are.
mm,
They're just leading their lives. You could see pictures and video of some of them at these occasions by going to the Sowams Heritage Area website. And there's a link at the top of every page to Pokanoket. And if you look at what opens up on that, you'll see a number of the times that they've done public presentations. You can also click on the events page in the menu and look for past or upcoming events that feature the tribe. We feel like the more people learn about this remarkable tribe, their history, their culture, the more they'll appreciate that it was their welcoming attitude
mm.
first permitted the English colonists to survive and eventually thrive in New England.
Yep.
So the tribe remains a proud and thankful people who everyone should get to know. And this podcast, I hope, will encourage more people to do just that.
Perfect. Great way to end it. Dave, I honestly really appreciate you joining the podcast today. Once again, everyone, if you want to have a better understanding of the history of Sowams, which makes up Eastern Rhode Island and then also parts of Southeastern Massachusetts as well, if you want to better understand the Pokanoket people and their history, I highly suggest looking at the Sowams Heritage Area website. So, Dave, thank you so much for your time today, and really appreciate all the insight you've provided.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to The Story of Rhode Island. If you are enjoying the podcast, please be sure to leave a review and to follow the podcast as well. If you'd like to learn more about today's episode and others as well, you can visit storyofrhodeisland.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at Story of Rhode Island or on Facebook at The Story of Rhode Island Podcast. Thank you again, and see you next time.